The thorny question that we have faced here when I've talked to people is that aspect of what's a digital twin, how do you define it, how do you start to use it? I quoted a little bit from the Gemini papers there, where it talked about keeping things loose. So from your point of view, why is this the right approach?
We kept it loose for a number of reasons, because too often, if you become prescriptive, you actually send people down a set avenue, a set road, and we wanted people to make their own decisions and have that. The baseline is a digital twin is a digital representation of a physical asset. That's as simple as. As that sort of the Gemini papers were finished, we then moved on to other topics, and at the end I alluded, we've just recently finished, about 2-3 weeks ago, a finance paper, and we actually went right to the other end of the spectrum. More often than not, we're talking about digital twins at an asset level or a contracting level, so a project digital twin, and therefore involves the consultants and supply chain. So we actually went, how do we drive adoption? How do we make this actually happen? So we interviewed about 33 banks and sat down with them, and they are already using digital twins of sorts to actually start making their calculations. And we got some real great insights. For example, some banks already, anything over £250 million loan, which is not a great deal of funds in today's construction world, are asking for a digital asset map of at that interview stage. So if you don't have that roadmap built of what you're going to control your asset, you're not going to get the money. So going back to your question, if we had sort of been very prescriptive and said this is what you need to do, we could have excluded some very influential parts from the industry. So we kept it as open and as loose as possible.
I had quite a few conversations with you over the past few months, and something that you've spoken to me a few times that I found really interesting was you talked, and you touched on it there, you talked about how people haven't realised that digital twins will be used in industries they just haven't thought of. So you've talked to me about insurance, car use, the finance world, and how they will start to expect or use digital twins to better understand the assets they're investing in or insuring, etc. So again, I think that's a point worth discussing.
Yeah, I mean, again, we sort of, learning is the main thing. Learning is that sort of very positive aspect from it. So I've spoken most recently to the car industry, and you look at that, we're all talking about modern methods of construction, off-site construction, and how that can be an impact in our industry. You look at the car industry and how that is actually progressing and how that is made, and that very much supply and demand aspect of actually having raw materials in their plants. So basically, when you talk to them and listen to them, you can take a great deal from it. But again, it's that engagement aspect. From the work we've done with Brisbane. And Brisbane was a really interesting project, and there was a podcast done by NCE, which I listened to very much. They actually met with Malcolm Taylor from Crossrail back in 2016 and took some lessons learned from that. And that actually, those lessons learned involved not only the client, but also the finance company. So a line in their contract that came available in 2019 was the request for digital twin. So they took that and went straight on and moved forward with it, and actually became very immersed with BIM caves and headsets. But they actually, because they were doing such a major project in Brisbane, they wanted the Joe public to be involved, and they actually had set up these BIM caves, and people came along and could actually see what they were expecting to actually see. Too often than not, we engage with Joe public, and they are given 2D drawings. We need to really cater for those. That, when you look at the automotive industry, when you're buying your car now, you go on and you see a replication on the car. So again, it's never going to be similar, but we can actually learn from those areas.
What about the transparency that's needed? Because, and again, I know we touched on it a little bit in one of the latter parts of the interviews that will come up online, but it's not a question I actually asked you, if I remember correctly. We're starting to see a lot of citywide digital twins either done, like you've just mentioned Brisbane, you also have places like Helsinki, which I know you mentioned, and Dublin. We also have, in this region, we're starting to see citywide digital twins being planned. So that's got to take a lot of different parties getting involved to get that working. How do you get that transparency that's required? Because there must be a lot of transparency needed for it to work properly.
I would say that leadership has to come from the client. that we're seeing now with projects is client-led. The client is now seeing the outcomes and the benefits for having that sort of request, and that leadership, that strong leadership, need to be enforced and pushed down at client level. So it is difficult, it is interesting, but the one thing I would say we've noticed over the last couple of years, I do say this very tastefully, what COVID has done, if there is any benefits from COVID, has driven a digital mindset within more people than we've ever seen before. You think 3 years ago, 4 years ago, Teams and Zoom and the use of those would have not been the norm, whereas now actually it's the norm to use something virtual than actually physical. So when you've got that mindset, you can capitalise on it and move forward with it. So again, strong leadership and now an adoption curve we need to take hold of.
Okay, and final question. In terms of taking the Gemini papers and using them in this region, because I guess every region needs to adapt to their unique nature so that they're fit for purpose. So what sort of, if people wanted to use those papers, what sort of work do you think they would need to be thinking about in terms of adapting so that they would work here?
The easiest thing I would say is communicate. Look at people, look at projects around you, look at what other areas are doing. That Brisbane example is a perfect one. They took lessons learned from London all the way down to Brisbane. So, I would say 80 to 90% of the problems we have on a construction site, I'm an ex-QS for my sins, they actually still are the same problems I faced 30 years ago when I entered industry. Those problems have not really changed a great deal. So by good communication, good working with other parties, you look and listen and learn of what other people have done and take that perfect example. I'll quote an ex-leader of a project I worked on. I actually worked on Crossrails, a gentleman called Roger Bailey, who's now over at Innovation at Thames Tideway. And he has a great quote: on any mega projects, we always take 3 steps forward. When that project finishes, we all take 2 steps back. If we communicate a little bit more, maybe it's only just a 1 step back.